The mirror's grin. The house was a specter of another time, older than the trees that clawed at the sky around it. It stood isolated, a derelict Victorian monument on the edge of a road that seemed forgotten even by the maps. The steep gables leaned inward as if bowing to the weight of decades, and the once proud facade was now cloaked in ivy and decay. Paint peeled like dead skin from its sides, exposing the raw, splintered wood beneath. It wasn't just its decrepit appearance that unnerved Lydia as she stood at the gate, staring up at her unexpected inheritance. The house exuded something heavier, something she couldn't name but felt in her bones. Lydia had inherited the house from her great-aunt Clara, a woman whose existence had been little more than a whisper in family conversations. Clara had been a recluse, living and dying within these walls, and the stories about her bordered on folklore. Some claimed she was a spiritualist, communing with forces unseen. Others whispered of rituals and shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Lydia had dismissed these tales as nonsense, until now. Standing there with the key in her hand, she hesitated. She wasn't superstitious, but something about the house felt wrong. She shook the thought away, steeling herself. It was just an old, creaky building. The lock resisted her first attempt, as if reluctant to open after so many years of abandonment. When it finally gave, the door groaned, swinging inward to reveal a yawning darkness. Lydia stepped inside, and the smell hit her first, a thick, cloying mixture of mildew, rot, and something metallic, like rust. The air was stale and heavy, clinging to her lungs. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally in the cavernous entryway, each creak of the floorboards stretching out far longer than it should. A sense of unease prickled at the back of her neck, but she pressed on, brushing off her discomfort as nerves. The house greeted her with silence, the kind that seemed almost deliberate. It wasn't just quiet, it was void-like, as though the space itself swallowed sound. Even her breathing felt muted. Lydia wandered through the first floor, her flashlight slicing through the thick gloom. The furniture was draped in yellowed sheets that seemed to sag with an unnatural weight, their shapes warped into strange silhouettes by years of neglect. Cobwebs hung thickly in the corners, their strands shimmering faintly in the dim light. The once ornate wallpaper was now peeling in great, curling sheets, revealing blackened plaster underneath. Family portraits hung crooked on the walls, their subjects trapped in discolored oils that seemed to watch her with disapproval. She paused before one of the larger paintings, a woman, pale and stern, wearing a high-collared black dress. Her eyes bore into Lydia, almost accusingly. She tore her gaze away, muttering to herself, "Old houses are just creepy, that's all." But the sensation of being watched lingered. The upstairs drew her next, the wooden staircase groaning under her weight. Each step felt like a betrayal, an intrusion into a space that had been undisturbed for years. The second floor was darker, colder. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sweet, almost sickly. Room after room revealed nothing but dust and decay, yet the oppressive feeling only grew stronger. It was as if the house itself was drawing her toward something, guiding her deeper into its labyrinth. And then she saw it, a door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, this door was locked. It was a plain wooden door, unassuming except for the tarnished brass knob. Lydia felt drawn to it immediately. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't turn. She jiggled it harder, then leaned her weight against it, but the door didn't budge. A faint vibration seemed to pulse beneath her hand, so subtle she almost thought she imagined it. She pressed her ear against the wood. At first, there was only silence. Then came the whispering. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A rhythmic, sibilant murmur, as though someone were reciting something just out of earshot. Lydia pulled back sharply, her heart pounding. "Hello," she called out, her voice thin and wavering. The whispering stopped instantly. She stared at the door, her breath catching. The air around it felt colder now, almost biting. Backing away, she told herself she was imagining things. It was just an old house, settling and creaking in the night. But as she turned to leave, she thought she heard something else, a soft click, like a lock sliding into place. When she spun back, the door remained shut, but now the hallway felt darker, as though the shadows were pressing in. Lydia set up her makeshift sleeping area in one of the guest rooms, hauling her suitcase upstairs and choosing the least dust-ridden mattress. The room was sparsely furnished, with a sagging bedframe and a single dresser, its mirror so tarnished it reflected little more than shadows. She lay on the bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows, but the house itself remained eerily silent. It wasn't the comforting stillness of a peaceful night, it was the absence of sound, oppressive and unnatural. As the hours dragged on, Lydia found herself drifting into a restless sleep. Her dreams were vivid and disjointed, filled with flashes of her great-aunt Clara. She saw her standing in a dimly lit room, her hands trembling as she whispered something incomprehensible. Behind Clara, the shadows seemed alive, writhing and twisting into shapes that defied reason. Lydia woke with a start, her heart racing. At first, she thought it was the wind that had woken her, but then she heard it again, the whispering. It was louder this time, a guttural chant that seemed to seep through the walls. Her pulse quickened as she realized it was coming from the hallway. Gripping her phone for light, she crept toward the sound, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The whispering grew louder with each step, until she was standing outside the locked door once again. The whispers stopped the moment she touched the handle. The next morning, Lydia was more determined than ever to open the locked door. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it felt like a compulsion, as though the house itself demanded it. She found a toolbox in the shed out back, its contents rusted but functional. Returning to the hallway, she hesitated briefly before wedging the chisel into the door frame. The lock resisted at first, but with a few determined strikes, it gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a room far smaller than she had anticipated. The space was no larger than a closet, empty except for a single object leaning against the far wall, a mirror. The mirror was massive, its ornate gold frame tarnished and blackened in places. The glass was warped and fogged with age, yet when Lydia stepped closer, her reflection was unnervingly clear. She stared at herself, feeling a strange disconnection. Her face looked wrong, paler than it should have been, her eyes sunken and shadowed. Behind her, the hallway and the reflection seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Then something moved in the mirror, a flicker of motion just behind her shoulder. Lydia spun around, but the hallway was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, her reflection was smiling. Lydia backed away from the mirror, her pulse thundering in her ears. The grin on her reflection lingered, impossibly wide and sinister, its eyes locking with hers in an unblinking stare. Her breath quickened as she felt a strange pull from the glass, as though invisible threads were trying to reel her in. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself, forcing her gaze away. When she glanced back, her reflection had returned to normal, gaunt, pale, and exhausted, but at least it wasn't smiling anymore. Leaving the room, Lydia closed the door tightly behind her, though the broken lock left it hanging slightly ajar. She descended the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath her feet amplified by the oppressive silence of the house. By the time she reached the kitchen, her nerves were raw. She rummaged through the cupboards, searching for anything to occupy her hands and mind, but the shelves were bare except for a few ancient jars of unidentifiable preserves. The heavy feeling in her chest didn't subside. As the sun dipped lower, shadows crept across the walls, stretching and contorting into shapes that felt unnatural. The house seemed to breathe with the coming night, the air growing colder, thicker. It started softly this time, a faint murmur that grew louder with every passing second. Lydia froze in place, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter. The whispering had returned. The sound wasn't confined to one area anymore. It emanated from the walls, the floorboards, the ceiling, a chorus of low, guttural voices, each overlapping the next. The words were unintelligible, yet their cadence suggested a purpose, a dark intent. Lydia clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers grew louder, penetrating her skull until her head throbbed. "Stop it," she screamed, her voice cracking. The whispering ceased instantly. The silence that followed was worse, a suffocating void that pressed down on her. She stumbled back from the counter, her chest heaving. For a moment, she thought it was over. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, a polite rapping that echoed through the house. Lydia turned toward the sound, her heart racing. It came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the front door. The knocking was upstairs. Lydia stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. The knocking turned into footsteps, deliberate and measured, pacing back and forth above her. The sound moved from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other, stopping directly above her head before resuming its restless journey. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at her to leave the house, to flee into the night without looking back. But she couldn't. Something rooted her in place, a force stronger than fear. The footsteps stopped. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, colder. Slowly, the silence gave way to a new sound, a long, slow scratching, like nails dragging across wood. It came from the direction of the locked door. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't happening." The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Gathering every ounce of courage, Lydia grabbed the hammer from the toolbox and began to climb the stairs. Her legs felt like lead, her breath shallow as she ascended. Each step creaked ominously, the sound blending with the relentless scratching. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw it. The door to the mirror room was wide open. The mirror dominated the small room, its warped glass gleaming faintly in the dim light. The air was icy cold, carrying a faint metallic tang that stung her nostrils. As Lydia approached the threshold, the scratching stopped. The house seemed to hold its breath. She peered into the room, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The mirror reflected the hallway behind her, but it was wrong. The shadows in the reflection were deeper, darker, and they seemed to move of their own accord. Then she saw it, a figure standing in the reflection. It was just behind her, a pale shape with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Lydia spun around, the hammer raised, but the hallway was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was closer. Her reflection was no longer hers. It was the figure, its features a grotesque parody of her own. The grin stretched impossibly wide, and its eyes bore into hers with malevolent glee. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice a distorted echo of her own. The glass began to ripple like water. Before Lydia could react, the mirror reached out. A cold, slimy hand shot through the glass, its fingers clawing at her wrist. She screamed, dropping the hammer as she struggled to pull away, but the hand's grip was inhumanly strong. The glass rippled and pulsed, dragging her closer. Lydia's feet slipped on the floor, her cries for help swallowed by the oppressive air. With one final tug, the mirror consumed her. The transition was instant. She found herself in a distorted version of the house, the colors muted and wrong. The walls oozed a dark, viscous liquid, and the air was thick with the stench of rot. Shadows slithered along the edges of her vision, their forms too amorphous to define but undeniably alive. The mirror behind her was gone, replaced by a blank wall. Lydia turned, her pulse racing as she took in her surroundings. Everything was warped, the angles too sharp, the spaces too vast or too confined. The house felt like a living organism, its walls pulsing faintly as though it had a heartbeat. Then she heard it, footsteps. She spun around, her flashlight flickering as she pointed it down the hallway. A figure stood at the far end, its silhouette identical to hers. "Who are you?" Lydia demanded, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. As it came into view, Lydia's stomach churned. It was her, a perfect copy, but its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the light. "You," it said, its voice an eerie echo. You shouldn't have come. It lunged. Lydia ran, the house twisting around her. Corridors stretched into infinity, doors led to nowhere, and the air grew thicker with each step. No matter how far she went, the doppelganger was always behind her, its hollow eyes burning into her back. Eventually, she found herself back in the mirror room. The glass was intact again, its surface smooth and still. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't hers. It was the doppelganger, grinning. Lydia screamed and pounded on the glass, but it didn't budge. On the other side, the doppelganger raised a hand in mock farewell before turning and walking away, leaving Lydia trapped in the mirror. As the whispers began anew, Lydia realized the truth: the house didn't just want her. It wanted to replace her. Lydia slammed her fists against the glass, her breath fogging the surface as she screamed. The sound echoed strangely, dull and warped, as though the mirror itself swallowed her cries. "No," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Let me out. Let me." Her reflection smiled at her, a cruel, twisted grin that didn't belong to her face. It raised its hand and placed it against the glass, mimicking her movements. But this wasn't her reflection. She could see the subtle differences, the slight tilt of its head, the gleam of malice in its hollow eyes, the way it seemed to breathe when she wasn't. The doppelganger leaned closer, its smile widening. "You'll get used to it," it whispered, the words barely audible yet vibrating through her skull. Before Lydia could respond, the doppelganger turned and walked away, disappearing into the warped corridors of the house beyond. The last thing she saw was its silhouette vanishing into the shadows, leaving her alone in the glass. Lydia turned to face her new prison. The space around her was endless yet suffocating, the air heavy with an acrid, metallic tang. The walls seemed to ripple and shift, as though alive, and the floor beneath her feet was cold and unyielding, yet it pulsed faintly like the beat of a distant heart. The whispering began again, louder now, closer. It surrounded her, pressing in from every direction. She spun around, her hands trembling, but there was nothing, just the endless void of the mirror's realm. Outside the mirror, the doppelganger moved through the house with a deliberate grace. It touched the walls, and the house seemed to respond, its groans of age turning into low, guttural moans. Shadows coiled and writhed around it like obedient pets, retreating only when it passed. In the kitchen, it opened drawers and rummaged through Lydia's belongings with a cold detachment, pulling out items that had once been hers. A photograph of her with her friends, a crumpled receipt from her favorite cafe. It tilted its head as it examined these fragments of her life, then placed them neatly on the counter. It wasn't just replacing her. It was erasing her. Inside the mirror, Lydia stumbled through the endless corridors, her mind racing. There had to be a way out. The doppelganger had come from somewhere, and if it could leave, then so could she. She began to notice patterns in the shifting landscape. The rippling walls would occasionally part, revealing glimpses of the house outside. These moments were brief, no longer than a heartbeat, but they were enough to spark hope. Each time a ripple appeared, she ran toward it, but the shifting space played cruel tricks on her, stretching the distance or sealing the gap before she could reach it. Frustration bubbled into despair as the whispering grew louder, now accompanied by faint laughter, mocking, cruel, and distinctly feminine. Lydia stopped to catch her breath, her chest heaving. As she leaned against a wall, she noticed something etched into its surface, symbols, carved deep into the pulsating material. They were angular and sharp, radiating an energy that made her skin crawl. She traced them with her fingers, and a shock of cold shot through her hand. The whispers receded momentarily, replaced by a low hum that seemed to vibrate in her chest. The symbols were a clue, she realized. As Lydia explored further, she found more of the strange carvings, each one etched into the walls, floors, and even the air itself. They seemed to form a pattern, guiding her deeper into the mirror's realm. The air grew colder as she followed the trail, the whispers growing quieter but more intense, as though they were waiting for her to piece something together. Finally, she reached a room unlike any she had seen before. It was circular, with walls that shimmered like liquid silver. At its center stood a pedestal, and atop it lay a jagged shard of glass. The shard pulsed faintly, its edges glowing with an otherworldly light. Lydia approached it cautiously, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't. Something about the shard called to her, its presence both terrifying and comforting. As she reached out to touch it, the whispering returned, deafening now. The voices overlapped, some pleading, others laughing, but all demanding the same thing. Take it. Her fingers closed around the shard, and the world exploded into light. Lydia was back in the house, standing in the mirror room. The shard was still in her hand, its edges cutting into her palm, though the pain felt distant. The doppelganger stood before her, its grin faltering for the first time. You shouldn't have done that, it hissed, its voice distorted with anger. Lydia raised the shard, feeling its power thrumming through her veins. The house seemed to recoil, its walls shuddering as though in pain. Shadows shrank away from her, retreating into the corners. The doppelganger lunged, its hands outstretched, but Lydia slashed at it with the shard. The glass sliced through the air, emitting a high-pitched wail as it connected. The doppelganger screamed, its form flickering and distorting. The house roared in protest, the walls closing in around her. Lydia felt the floor beneath her feet begin to crumble, but she didn't stop. She struck again and again, each blow weakening the doppelganger until it collapsed into a puddle of black ichor. The mirror behind her shattered, its shards raining down like silver rain. When Lydia opened her eyes, she was outside, standing on the overgrown lawn. The house loomed behind her, its windows dark and lifeless. She turned to leave, but something stopped her. A faint whisper, carried on the wind. She glanced down at her hand. The shard was still there, its glow dim but persistent. She knew the truth, even if she didn't want to admit it. The house wasn't done with her. Not yet. Lydia's chest heaved as she stood amidst the shattered remains of the mirror. Her pulse raced, adrenaline surging through her veins, yet there was no satisfaction in her victory. The house groaned in defiance, the dark heart of it seemingly alive, watching her every move. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the room around her flickering with strange lights. For a brief moment, she thought she had won, had shattered the mirror, broken free of her reflection. But the victory felt hollow. She turned toward the door, her breath shallow, her legs trembling beneath her. With the shard still clutched tightly in her hand, she stumbled toward the exit. Not yet, a voice whispered behind her. The voice was soft, almost seductive, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of malice. Lydia froze, her heart skipping a beat. The voice was not from within the house, it was inside her head. The whisper grew louder. Not yet, Lydia. You're still ours. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as the walls around her pulsed again, the air growing dense and heavy. Shadows stretched across the floor, creeping toward her. Something was wrong, she could feel it, the very fabric of the house shifting in response to her movement. The door, the only way out, loomed in front of her, but it felt miles away. No, she whispered to herself, shaking her head. It's not real. I won. But deep down, she knew the truth, the house had never let her leave. The shadows in the corners of the room began to twist and coil, taking on shapes too horrific to comprehend. They were figures, dark, monstrous figures with distorted faces and contorted limbs, emerging from the very walls themselves. They crept toward her, their footsteps a sickening squelch on the wet, rotting floor. Lydia backed away, clutching the shard as though it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. She had seen these creatures before, in the mirror, in the reflections of things that should never have existed. But now they were real, here, in the same room as her. She could hear their breath, thick and wet, their eyes gleaming with hunger. They were the house's guardians, its twisted sentinels. Lydia swung the shard in front of her, its jagged edges glowing faintly in the dark. Each movement felt heavier, as though the air itself was pressing down on her. The creatures hissed in response, their movements swift and unsettling. They lunged at her, but Lydia reacted faster, slashing at one with the shard. The creature screeched, its form disintegrating into a pile of black smoke and ash. But there were more, so many more. Each creature seemed to be a distorted version of herself, limbs too long, faces twisted into nightmarish parodies, eyes blackened with malice. The more she fought, the more they seemed to multiply, like shadows spreading across the room. The house was toying with her. Lydia ran, her legs burning, her heart hammering in her chest. She darted through the house, the walls shifting again, elongating and contracting like the gaping maw of a beast ready to swallow her whole. The path to the door seemed longer, more treacherous, and the further she went, the more the house seemed to twist around her, cutting off her escape routes, forcing her deeper into its labyrinthine guts. Every corner she turned led her back to the same room, the same hallway. The same dark, pulsing shadows. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into words, commands, and insistent demands. "Return to us, Lydia," the house crooned. "You cannot escape what you have become." The walls around her seemed to close in. The once solid floor beneath her feet began to squelch, turning soft and spongy like wet earth. She glanced down and saw the floor rippling, as though it were alive, and with a sickening realization, she understood, it was hungry. Without warning, the ground beneath her cracked open, jagged teeth appearing along the edges. Lydia screamed as her foot was sucked into the dark abyss, pulling her down, deeper into the house. She clawed at the floor, her fingers scraping against the slick, decaying surface, but the darkness below her was relentless. The last thing she saw before the abyss swallowed her whole was the reflection of herself in the mirror room, the doppelganger, grinning wickedly, watching her as she was consumed. When Lydia opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the house, or at least, it didn't feel like it. The air around her was still, oppressive, yet somehow lighter. The shadows that once loomed over every inch of her world seemed to recede, as though the house had been drained of its malice. She was standing in the center of a room, the walls smooth and untouched by time, the air sterile. But as she looked down, she realized she was no longer Lydia. Her hands, pale and delicate, were no longer her own. Her fingers were elongated, almost translucent, like the doppelganger's. Her reflection, if she dared to look, would be a twisted version of the woman she had once been, standing still with a mocking grin on her face. In that moment, she knew with crushing certainty that the house had claimed her. It hadn't let her escape, it had merely waited for her to break. And now, the house had its prize. The door behind her creaked open. Lydia, or whatever she had become, turned slowly, her movements unnervingly fluid, like a marionette whose strings had been pulled taut. The doppelganger stood in the doorway, no longer an enemy, but an ally. Its grin had faded, but its hollow eyes gleamed with satisfaction. The house was complete. Lydia, or the thing that had once been her, stepped forward, her reflection now a twisted, lifeless imitation of the woman she had been. The whispering was gone. The house no longer needed to call her. It had taken her soul, had crushed her will, and now it had its perfect, twisted new form. Behind her, the doors to the house began to creak open once more. The world outside was oblivious to the horrors unfolding within the house. To anyone who might wander by, it seemed like a decrepit, abandoned ruin, empty and silent. But within, the house lived on, and so did the echoes of its victims. Lydia's house was a prison now, a place where every living soul that stepped through its threshold would meet the same fate. For the house had a hunger, an insatiable hunger, that would never be satisfied.